I was co-signing the mortgage for our dream home when the notary paused. She showed me a previous application my fiancé had filed just weeks ago, with another woman's name and my social security number. Now he's claiming it was a test, but the other woman is currently standing on our porch, claiming she's the real bride. The heavy fountain pen felt like a wand in my hand, ready to conjure the life I had spent 40 years waiting for. I looked at Mark, his hand resting casually on the back of my chair, his thumb tracing small, comforting circles on my shoulder. We were minutes away from owning the colonial-style house on Willow Lane, the one with the wraparound porch where I imagined us drinking tea well into our 70s. The office of the notary, Mrs. Gable, was stiflingly quiet, filled with the scent of old dust, floor wax, and the vanilla perfume she wore. I leaned forward, the tip of the pen hovering just above the signature line, my heart doing a little dance of pure, unadulterated excitement. Then the world stopped moving. Mrs. Gable, a woman who had spent 30 years looking at titles and deeds with a clinical eye, suddenly pulled the folder back toward her chest. She didn't look at Mark, she looked directly at me, her spectacles sliding slightly down the bridge of her nose. The air in the room seemed to vanish. She didn't speak at first, but her fingers fumbled with a secondary manila folder tucked beneath our primary contract. I watched as she pulled out a single sheet of paper, her expression shifting from professional warmth to a deep, furrowed concern. She slid the paper across the mahogany table. It wasn't our mortgage application. It was a rejection notice from a different lender, dated only 2 weeks ago. My eyes scanned the page looking for a mistake, but what I saw felt like a physical weight pressing against my lungs. My social security number was there, bold and unmistakable, but the name typed next to it wasn't mine. It was Elena Vance. I stared at that name, Elena. Looked so foreign yet so permanent on the page. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a clerical error? A typo by a tired bank teller? I looked up at Mark, expecting him to laugh or look equally confused. Instead, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes that I had never seen before. A sharp, calculating panic that he quickly smothered under a mask of confusion. He reached for the paper, but Mrs. Gable kept her hand firmly on it. She told me, in a voice that was far too soft, that this application had been flagged for identity discrepancies. Someone had tried to buy a property in a different county using my credit profile and my identity, but with this other woman's name as the primary occupant. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, each second sounding like a hammer blow. I started to think back to the last month, the small glitches that I had laughed off as wedding stress. There was the afternoon I couldn't find my birth certificate in the firebox, and Mark had spent 3 hours helping me look, eventually saying I must have left it at my mother's house. Then there were the afternoon walks he started taking, always leaving his phone on the charger but taking a small burner-style flip phone I'd seen in his glove box. He told me it was for work, a secure line for his clients. I had believed him. I had believed everything. I felt a cold chill settle into my bones as I realized he had been the one insisting on handling all the digital uploads for our joint application, telling me to focus on the fun stuff, like picking out paint colors and curtains. Mark. I finally whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to a ghost. Who is Elena? He didn't answer immediately. He took a long, slow breath, his chest expanding as he tried to regain his footing. He didn't look like the man I'd shared a bed with for 3 years. He looked like a stranger wearing his skin. He stood up abruptly, the legs of the heavy chair screeching against the hardwood floor. He told Mrs. Gable there had been a misunderstanding and that we needed a moment to discuss private financial matters in the hallway. I followed him out, my legs feeling like lead. In the narrow, dimly lit hallway of the lawyer's office, Mark turned to face me. His face was a ghostly white, sweat beaded at his hairline despite the air conditioning. He took my hands but I pulled them away. Then came the defense, a frantic high-speed explanation that sounded like a script he'd been writing in his head for weeks. He claimed it was a test. He said he wanted to see if the bank's fraud detection was actually working before we put our life savings into the Willow Lane house. He told me he'd used a dummy name and my information just to check the security of the system. It was the most ridiculous thing I had ever heard, a lie so thin I could see right through it to the darkness underneath. I watched his lips move, but the words felt like they were coming from a great distance. I saw the way he shifted his weight, the way his eyes darted to the exit sign. He wasn't trying to protect our future. He was trying to protect his exit strategy. The drive home was a nightmare captured in slow motion. Usually we talked about dinner or the radio played a soft jazz station, but today the only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt. A thick gray fog had begun to roll in from the coast, swallowing the familiar landmarks of our town. The local bakery, the park where he'd proposed, the library, they all looked like cardboard cutouts, fragile and fake. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, my mind a whirlwind of memories. I thought about the weekend trips he took to visit his sick uncle in the city. I thought about the way he always turned his laptop screen away when I walked into the room. I was digging through the last 3 years, unearthing every tiny lie I had buried under the rug of my own affection. How many versions of us had he been building? Was I the main character in his life or just the financier for a different story he was writing with a woman named Elena? When we finally turned into our gravel driveway, the headlights of the car cut through the thickening fog. At first I thought I was hallucinating. There, standing on our front porch, was a woman. She was dressed in a soft floral-patterned coat that looked expensive and sensible. She wasn't banging on the door. She was just standing there, holding a set of keys in her hand, looking up at the house with an expression of quiet ownership. She looked around my age, maybe a few years younger, with hair pinned back in a neat, professional style. Mark slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the wet gravel. He let out a choked sound, a mix of a sob and a curse. I didn't wait for him to speak. I pushed the car door open and stepped out into the damp air. The woman turned toward the sound of the car, a small, hopeful smile forming on her lips, until she saw me. The realization hit me then, sharper than any blade. This wasn't just a paper trail error or a case of identity theft. This woman wasn't a thief, she was a guest. No, she was more than a guest. She stood there with a sense of belonging that matched my own. The key she held glinted in the porch light, a perfect replica of the one sitting in my purse. My life hadn't just been compromised, it had been duplicated. And as she stepped forward, asking if Mark was finally home, I realized the other woman wasn't hiding in the shadows. She was standing in my light, claiming my porch, my home, and my husband-to-be as her own. The gravel crunched under my boots, a harsh, jagged sound in the sudden quiet of the yard. The woman in the floral coat didn't move. She just stood there on my welcome mat, her knuckles white as she gripped a thick, cream-colored envelope. As I drew closer, I could see the embossed gold foil on the flap, the exact same stationery I had spent 3 weeks picking out for our June ceremony. "Can I help you?" I asked, though my voice felt like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. She looked at me, her eyes darting from my face to the car where Mark was still slumped behind the steering wheel, his head in his hands. "I'm looking for Mark," she said, her voice trembling but soft. "He told me to meet him here. He said we were finally moving in today." She held up the envelope. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a complete wedding suite. Same date, same venue, same floral arrangement. The only difference was the name printed in elegant script next to his. Elena Vance. Mark finally emerged from the car, his movements slow and jerky like a broken marionette. He stepped between us, his hands held out in a placating gesture that made my skin crawl. "Ladies, please," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the neighbors' windows. "There's a perfectly reasonable explanation for this. Elena, this is Sarah. She's the one I told you about. My sister." The word sister hung in the humid air like a foul odor. I felt a surge of cold fury, but before I could speak, Elena's face crumpled. She looked at me not with malice, but with a profound, terrifying confusion. "Your sister?" she whispered, looking back at Mark. "You told me she was in a private facility. You said she was unstable, Mark. You said she'd spent your family's entire inheritance and ruined your credit score." I took a step toward her, ignoring Mark entirely. "I'm not his sister, Elena. I'm the woman who signed the lease on this house. I'm the woman whose social security number is on the mortgage application you tried to file 2 weeks ago." The realization didn't hit us like a lightning bolt. It was more like a slow, poisonous leak. Elena's hand went to her mouth. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a key, the one I'd seen from the car. I reached into my own pocket and produced mine. We held them up in the porch light. They were identical twins. Mark tried to cut in, spinning a desperate yarn about how he was just trying to manage a difficult family situation, and that I was having an episode, but his voice was climbing an octave with every lie. He was a man watching his two worlds collide on a Tuesday evening in the suburbs, and he had no more scripts left to read. "Come inside," I said to Elena, my voice surprisingly steady. I didn't ask, I commanded. Mark tried to follow, but I turned on him with a look that froze him at the threshold. "You stay on the porch, Mark. If you set foot in this house, I'm calling the police for trespassing. Stay where I can see you." I led Elena into the entryway. The house smelled of the lavender candles I liked to burn, a scent that now felt like a mockery. I led her straight to the fireplace mantel. I pointed to the framed photos. Us at the beach, us at Christmas, us the day we got engaged. Elena's knees gave out and she sank onto the edge of the sofa. "He told me these were all old photos of him and his ex-wife who passed away," she sobbed, her composure finally shattering. "He told me he bought this furniture for us. I've been sending him half my paycheck every month for the down payment fund." I felt a hollow ringing in my ears. It wasn't just a physical betrayal. It was a financial assassination. He hadn't just cheated. He had used my identity as a foundation to build a secondary life with her, likely using her cash to pay off the debts he was accruing in my name. I realized then that we were both being harvested. "Stay here," I told her. I walked into Mark's small den, a room I'd always respected as his private workspace. He'd kept it locked for months, claiming he was handling sensitive client data. Tonight the door was ajar, a rare slip-up in his panic. I didn't hesitate. I went straight for the mahogany desk and began pulling drawers open. Elena joined me a moment later, her eyes red but her expression hardening into something sharper. Together we tore through his organized facade. Under a false bottom in a filing box, we found it, a thick blue folder labeled Project Delta. It wasn't a work project. It was a manual for our destruction. Inside was a printed spreadsheet, a literal timeline of his deception. He had mapped out my inheritance schedule, noting exactly when my grandmother's trust would be accessible. Next to it were Elena's bank account details. He had calculated the exact date he could drain my accounts, use my credit to secure a final massive loan, and then disappear with Elena to a lakeside property in another state. A property already purchased in her name but with my stolen funds. He had even written notes on how to manage our emotional outbursts to keep us compliant. It was cold, calculated, and utterly predatory. "He is a monster," Elena whispered, holding a printout of my birth certificate that he'd clearly scanned and edited. "No," I said, my voice cold. "He's a criminal." I picked up the landline, my fingers trembling so hard I nearly dropped the receiver. I didn't call the local precinct. I called the fraud department and then the emergency line. I told the operator exactly what was happening: identity theft, grand larceny, and a man outside who was currently trying to flee. As I spoke, I looked out the window. Mark was pacing the lawn, his shadows long and distorted under the streetlights. He looked small, pathetic. The sirens began as a distant hum, growing into a scream that tore through the quiet neighborhood. I saw the lights first, flashes of red and blue bouncing off the sold sign in our front yard. The neighbors, the same ones I'd invited to our housewarming party, were parting their curtains, their faces pale behind the glass. The police didn't take long. They found Mark trying to climb into his car, his pockets stuffed with a passport and a bundle of cash he'd hidden in the garage. I stood on the porch with Elena, our shoulders touching as they clicked the metal cuffs around his wrists. He didn't look at us. He looked at the ground, his shoulders slumped, the charming fiancé persona finally discarded like a used tissue. The dream home was now a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape that fluttered in the night breeze. By midnight, the house was silent again. The police had taken our statements and hauled Mark away. Elena and I sat at the kitchen island, a single pot of tea sitting between us. Neither of us had spoken for 20 minutes. I looked down at my hand, at the 2-carat diamond ring that had felt so heavy with promise only hours ago. Now it just felt like a shackle. I remembered a notification I'd received from my credit card app 3 months ago. A large purchase at a high-end jeweler that Mark had brushed off as a clerical error he would fix. I realized now that I had paid for my own engagement ring. Every sparkle on that stone was a debt I owed, a reminder of how thoroughly he had picked my life apart while I was busy dreaming of centerpieces and floor plans. I slid the ring off my finger. It made a tiny hollow clink as I dropped it into the cold dregs of my teacup. Elena looked at it, then slowly removed her own matching band and did the same. We sat there in the dim kitchen light, two women who had lost everything they thought was real, but who were finally, for the first time in years, standing on solid ground. The tea in the cups grew stone cold, but neither Elena nor I moved to heat the kettle. The silence of the kitchen was no longer heavy with shock. It was beginning to hum with the low, vibrating energy of survival. The next morning, the sun rose with a cruel brightness, shining through the windows of a house that was now a monument to a phantom life. I didn't spend the day crying. Instead, I grabbed a yellow legal pad and a box of highlighters. If Mark had treated my life like a ledger to be manipulated, I was going to treat his downfall like a surgical operation. The weeks that followed were a grueling marathon through the beige hallways of bureaucracy. I spent hours sitting in plastic chairs at the Social Security office, clutching a police report like a shield. Explaining to a clerk that your fiancé cloned your existence is one thing, proving it through a mountain of affidavits is another. I had to freeze every account, change every password, and watch as bank tellers looked at me with a mix of pity and suspicion. Each denied flag I had to clear felt like scrubbing a stain out of a white carpet. It was exhausting, repetitive work, but there was a strange, cold comfort in the paperwork. Every form I filed was a stitch, closing the wound he had ripped open. The most significant victory came on a Tuesday afternoon when I received a formal letter from the mortgage lender. The dream home contract was officially dissolved, the fraudulent application purged, and the substantial deposit, the money I had earned through years of overtime, was wired back into an account that only I could touch. During this time, Elena became the only person who truly understood the skin-crawling sensation of having been hunted. We met at a small diner halfway between our homes every Thursday. At first we spoke mostly about the case, comparing the dates of his lies like pieces of a puzzle. We discovered that on the day he told me he was at a funeral, he had taken her to a vineyard. On the night he told her he was working late, he was at home with me watching a movie. But as the weeks turned into months, the talk shifted. We stopped being victims of Mark and started being friends in our own right. When the preliminary hearings began, Mark's legal team tried to play a disgusting card. They attempted to portray us as two emotional, scorned women, who were simply lashing out after a messy breakup. They tried to argue that Mark had permission to use my details for what they called temporary bridge financing. Standing in that courtroom, I felt the heat rise in my neck, but Elena reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. We weren't the caricatures they wanted us to be. We were composed, we were prepared, and we were united. We had dinner afterward at a quiet Italian place, laughing over a bottle of wine as we realized that Mark's greatest mistake wasn't the fraud. It was underestimating the fact that the two women he tried to erase would end up becoming each other's strongest advocates. The house on Willow Lane had to be cleared out. I couldn't stand the sight of the velvet sofa we'd picked out or the silver cutlery that was meant for our first Thanksgiving. I decided to hold a massive estate sale. I posted signs all over the neighborhood. Everything must go. On the morning of the sale, a crowd of bargain hunters swarmed the lawn. I stood in the center of the living room, watching strangers haggle over the headboard where I'd once dreamt of a future. A woman bought the crystal vases for $20. A young couple hauled away the dining table. With every item that left the front door, the house felt lighter. It was a physical exorcism. By 4 o'clock, the rooms were empty, echoing with the sound of my own footsteps. I sat on the bare floor with a wad of cash in my pocket, feeling a profound, cathartic sense of space. The dream was gone, and in its place was a blank, clean slate. The trial itself was a somber affair. Mark sat at the defense table, his expensive suit looking a bit too large for him now, his charm replaced by a frantic, shifty-eyed desperation. When it was my turn to take the witness box, the room felt like it had run out of oxygen. His lawyer tried to rattle me, asking if I had prompted the confrontation on the porch. I looked past the lawyer straight at Mark. He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "I don't need to prompt the truth," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the chamber. "I have the truth on record." I produced the final piece of evidence that his lawyers didn't know existed. The night of the confrontation, I had activated the cloud recording feature on our new smart doorbell camera, a feature Mark had forgotten he'd installed himself. The court listened to the recording. Mark's voice, clear and panicked, admitting to Elena that he had used my identity assets because I was too unstable to notice. It was the sound of a predator caught in his own trap. The judge's face turned to stone as the recording played. That test he claimed to be running ended right there, resulting in a 6-year sentence for multiple counts of identity theft, wire fraud and grand larceny. As the bailiff led him away, I didn't feel a surge of joy. I just felt a quiet, settled peace. The debt was paid. 6 months later, I moved into a small, third-floor apartment in the city. It wasn't a colonial with a wraparound porch, but it had a balcony that caught the morning sun and a lock that only one person had a key to. I had spent months meticulously rebuilding my credit, and the day I was approved for this lease on my own merit was the proudest moment of my life. My record was clean, my credit file was locked behind a wall of security, and my name, my actual legal name, belonged only to me. I stood on the balcony one Saturday morning, looking at a framed photo on the small bistro table. It was a picture Elena had taken of us last month when we went hiking in the foothills. We were both sweaty, wind-blown, and laughing, our hiking boots caked in mud. We didn't look like victims. We looked like survivors. I realized then that I had spent so long looking for a dream home in the form of a building or a marriage, thinking that a house would provide the security I craved. But as I looked out at the city skyline, I knew better. My home wasn't made of bricks and mahogany. It was built out of the resilience I'd discovered when everything else was stripped away. I wasn't just Sarah again. I was a version of myself that could never be stolen. I took a deep breath of the crisp air, picked up my coffee and stepped back inside, finally at home in my own life.